In the paper, I mentioned the asset envy. They understand that there's pros and cons about being an asset, or they cannot necessarily move to another club. They cannot decide where they're going to play, but at least the assets have opportunities. They have resources coming to them. A financial firm will value each player. What they will say is, what if I give you $500,000 now in exchange for 5% of your future earnings? You try to put similar value players together in a pool. What they agree that they are going to share a certain percentage of their future earnings with the other members of the pool.
This is the Assetizer Podcast.
Hi there, and welcome to the Assetizer. Today, I'm excited to share my conversation with Pier-Luc Nappert, an accounting professor with a fascinating background in baseball. Pier-Luc spent years working in the industry, including 3 seasons with the Toronto Blue Jays, before turning his academic attention to what he calls assetization in sports. In this interview, we explore how minor league baseball players are essentially turning themselves into investable assets. They're working with financial firms that offer upfront capital in exchange for a percentage of future earnings, similar to how venture capitalists invest in startups. We'll discover 2 fascinating models: direct equity investments in individual players and income pooling where players share risk collectively. This is assetization in its purest form, creating investment products from human potential. If you've ever wondered how financial innovation is transforming sports or how athletes are finding creative ways to fund their careers, you won't want to miss this conversation. Let's dive in. Hi, Pier-Luc. How you doing? Welcome to the Assetizer.
Thank you. I'm doing very fine. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you. So where are you calling us from today?
I am in Quebec City. So as you can imagine, we are in late February. There's a lot of snow, but hopefully at some point spring will be coming.
Well, it looks warm and toasty where you are. Inside?
Yeah, I'm inside. I'm in the office at the university, so cannot complain now.
Okay. All right. So Pier-Luc, let's talk a bit about you first. So you are the reason why we invited you is you are an assetization academic to a certain degree, or you study assetization. So you want to tell us a bit about your background and what you work on?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So my plan at first was not necessarily to be an academic, and certainly not to write anything about assetization. So I'm an accountant by trade. I have my CPA from Canada. I worked mainly in organizations, inside organizations, in the sport business. So I spent maybe 10 years in different sport organizations, mostly in baseball. So I am kind of familiar with what's going on there. And at some point, I just realized that I wanted to do something else. I love teaching. I love the opportunity to engage with people. So I went back to university. I did my my PhD in accounting at York University, which is based in Toronto. And I had the opportunity to work on the sports-related topics for my dissertation. And at first, I was not necessarily thinking about assetization, but as I was going into the field, looking what was going on, I realized that there's a lot of assetization going at a lot of different places, especially in the world of sports. And it definitely caught my attention.
Okay, so, and that's what we really want to talk about today, because you wrote a paper on the assetization of baseball players, which we want to take a deep dive into. But actually, before we get to that, like, what did you do in the baseball world? And for which teams?
So I was at first in a minor league club. It's called the Quebec Capitals. It's the independent baseball club in, now it's in the Frontier League. But when I was there a few years ago, actually more than 10 years ago, It was in the Can-Am League. So it's not necessarily affiliated with minor league baseball or Major League Baseball. It's an independent league. Most players there have had some exposure at the minor league level. Some are trying to get into minor league baseball. And when I say minor league baseball, it's the AAA, AA,
Right.
IA. So the old system underneath Major League Baseball. So some players are trying to get there. Others have been there and are just trying to wrap up their career in a nice competitive environment. So I spent 7 years there doing a lot of different things. As you can imagine, it's a very small organization. So the overall budget at that time was around $2 million a year. So now it has increased a bit. But as you can imagine, we were in the office, jack of all trades. We needed to do a bit of everything. So I was in charge of the finance, being an accountant. But some days I was cleaning the seats, just make sure that the stadium was neat. I was at the ticket office selling tickets sometimes, selling sponsorships, so doing a little bit of everything. And then for family reasons, had the opportunity to move to Toronto. And I had the great opportunity to work in finance for the Toronto Blue Jays.
Really?
Yeah, so I spent 3 years there. A lot of fun. It was during the when they came back, basically in 2015. They were not necessarily a power horse at that time, but they made a couple of nice trades at the trade deadline, and the team made the postseason. There was the famous bat flip by Jose Bautista that year.
Yeah.
So the old city was crazy, and I was just fortunate to be a part of the organization at that time. So I spent 3 years there, and then I moved back to academia.
As you know, we wrote this book called Assetization. And while writing that, we came across sort of this little world of assetization academics, which we didn't even know existed. So it's something that people have been interested in, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you understand under the term, without getting, it's a big term, so you can get lost in the weeds there, but a little bit about what you understand about assetization and why you think it's an interesting field of study.
Yeah, well, as an accountant, as you can imagine, the asset is something that is very important in our world. It's the top half of the balance sheet, really. So we spend, as accountants, a lot of time about trying to value and record things as assets on the balance sheet. Now, the accounting criteria for recording something as an asset is quite stringent. So there's a lot of assets that don't appear on the balance sheet. And I'm thinking here about intangible assets that are internally developed. If you purchase, I don't know, a patent, you can record that on the balance sheet. But if you develop the technology, it does not appear anywhere on your balance sheet. So it's something that is sometimes taken for granted by accountants. And I was trying at that time to explain what was going on in baseball, and we can come back to that later. But I was not able to to have a word that could describe what was going on. And when I read Keen Birch's book about assetization, I felt like this is it. And how I use the term assetization, because even in the academic world, we don't necessarily use the term necessarily exactly the same, if I can say it that way.
Yeah.
To me, it's about first creating, transforming things into assets. And the assets are something that can be owned, of course, but something that can be managed as well. So to me, it's mostly a mode of governance. It's not necessarily about the semantic of it, like, is it on a balance sheet? Is it not on a balance sheet? It's really about how you manage things, or in my case, people, as assets, because you can consider things to be commodities. You can consider things to be just people to be employees. But framing something as an asset is one, powerful, and second, it's performative in the sense that it creates something, and it shapes how you view this thing, and what you do with it.
Okay. So we kind of commented from a very similar idea, right? That turning things into assets, and that may not have been before, but obviously when you say things like making people into assets, that can make some people uncomfortable, or that can come off in a kind of a strange way. So that's why I like this baseball story a lot, because it's actually the players themselves who want to do this. So you want to maybe take us into a bit of what your paper's about, and how these minor league players and aspiring athletes are using assetization.
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally understand the discomfort about talking about people in asset terms. There's obviously there's a negative connotation to that, that can be traced back to slavery. So I'm not trying to say here that baseball players are slaves, and that is not necessarily what is going on. So just to make sure that we understand exactly what's going on. So I can maybe start back about what it is to be a baseball player. So imagine you are 20, 21, you've been into college, or sometimes just out of high school. You can be 17 or 18-year-old, and you are drafted or signed as a free agent by a Major League Baseball organization. So at that time, what happens is you receive a signing bonus. So that can vary from, I guess the highest bonuses have been in the neighborhood of $8-9 million US.
Wow.
So that can be a lot of money. But that would be just for the best prospects in the game, the first couple of picks each year. Down the list, if you are still fortunate to be drafted by a Major League Baseball organization, but you are not necessarily viewed as a top prospect, your bonus might be $10,000 or even $1,000. And sometimes I've heard players saying, well, they gave us a couple of baseball bats, a bag of chips, and here's your plane tickets to get to Arizona, Florida. So,
okay.
So you get some sort of money, but there's a lot of inequalities there. Then you get into the minor league system. So you are under contract with your major league organization for roughly 5 or 6 years. There's a lot of different rules and nuances. I don't want necessarily to get into that, but let's say that you are under contract for 5 or 6 years until you reach to the major league level. You get into the major league level. So if that's the case, the clock starts again for another 6 years. So imagine you're 21, you need 5 years of development in the minor league system where you play in A-ball, Double A, a couple of seasons in Triple A, and then you get the chance to move to major league level. The clock starts again, and you might be under contract with your original major league organization for 11, 12 years maybe. So only at 32 you will have the opportunity to become a free agent and sign with any team. At 32, most baseball players are declining. Basically, their skills are greatly diminished. So there's not a lot of value left for these players. So you can see what's going on. The players are controlled by the major league organization for a long time. During their time in the the minor league level, pardon me, they are not paid a lot of money. Things have improved in the last couple of years, but when I was studying this field, and most of my time in baseball, we're talking about, if you're lucky, maybe $10,000 a year. So
Oh, wow.
these players are poor.
You can't live on that. Yeah.
No, so they're paid only during the season, which usually is between April and September. The rest of the year, they need to work. They drive Uber taxis. They work in restaurant. They teach baseball lessons to kids. So they're just trying to have some income at that time. But as you can imagine, if you are a low bonus player and you're trying to make a living out of it, you cannot train during the postseason, during the off season. You cannot hire a coach. You cannot have access to high-end facilities. Whereas if you are a top prospect who had a few $1 million bonus, well, you can do all of these things. So you can improve and you can invest in yourself and increase your odds of becoming a Major League Baseball player. So that's basically the system that these players are in. It's I wouldn't say necessarily a winner take all, but it's a winner take most dynamic where you have a few players who will make probably a potentially $100 million in their career, and the vast majority of them will end up being released after 3 or 4 years in the minor leagues, and will never have an opportunity to play a single game in Major League Baseball. So a lot of inequalities in that field. What is going on is that these players realize that there's assetization happening by Major League Baseball clubs. And here I'm talking about Major League Baseball, but you can probably apply that to any sport where clubs control the players. They can decide if they want to trade them to another club. In some leagues, especially in Europe, you can actually sell the contract to another club. In football, European football, that's quite common. So these contracts are really the assets of the club. And here I'm not talking about whether these contracts are recorded on the balance sheet or not. That's irrelevant. It's how they manage these players. And for a long time, just to come back to the North American sports setting, for a long time, players were actually considered legally to be the assets of of different clubs. So there's a couple of famous court cases that rule that players are indeed the assets of the organization, and that had important tax consequences, because when a club was purchased, the new owner basically valued all the assets of the club, and they valued the player contracts at a certain amount. These contracts were amortizable, so you can basically reduce your taxable income each year, whereas the franchise value was not. So if you applied, I don't know, out of the I will say some at that time the franchise valuations were not that high. So let's say we're talking about you purchase a franchise for $10 million. You will say, well, 8 million of that value is related to the player contracts, and 2 million is related to the franchise value. So let's say the 8 million that you apply to it, you can basically deduct a fifth of that amount each year for the next 5 years. So you can turn a profit into a loss, and that is very beneficial from a tax perspective. So at some point, the Internal Revenue Service in the U.S. and Congress tried to fix that, just to make sure that owners were not going to manipulate these amounts. And players were not necessarily considered assets from an accounting and a legal perspective as much. Around the same time, players gained free agency rights. So that was not necessarily the case before the
Right.
1970s. So because players became free agents, some clubs decided not necessarily to invest that much in their home players, and they just wanted to bid for other clubs' players. But what happened at some point is that clubs, and I think we can trace this back to Moneyball, the famous book and movie about the Oakland Athletics, and clubs realized that actually we control players. They are very valuable. We can think about them in terms of asset, and we can try to invest in these assets. So what happened is clubs became much more conscious about the well-being of their players. So if you invested, I don't know, $5 million on a signing bonus for a guy, you want to make sure that he eats properly, that he's well rested, that he's not going to be injured. So clubs start to invest a lot in the infrastructure related to player development. And to me, that's kind of a positive of assetization. Like when I said that it's a mode of governance, it's a way to think about things as assets. It means that these things are valuable. It's not just a commodity that you can change one player for another. These are your future stars, and you want to make sure that they are well and that they will be ready to perform for you. So the top prospects realize that they are assets, but what I will call the organizational players, the guys that didn't necessarily have the opportunity to get a high signing bonus, they realize that some players are assets and they want to become one.
That's interesting. That's what they want to become, right?
So
because they want to level the playing field, I understand.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So in the paper, I mentioned the asset envy. So they want to become an asset. They understand that there's pros and cons about being an asset, but just because they are part of the Major League Baseball organization, they have the cons. So they cannot necessarily move to another club. They cannot decide where they're going to play. This is all controlled by the organization. But at least the assets have opportunities. They have resources coming to them. So the guy. So there's basically a two-tier: the haves and the have-not. So the have-not want to have it. They want to become assets. They want to feel valued by their organization. And this is basically the landscape or the portrait of this industry. And this is where financial firms enter the field, because they realize that maybe we can provide financial tools to transform some of these players into assets.
Right, and that's if I've understood it correctly, that's sort of the other side of the coin, right? So some of these minor league players who you're saying are they don't have a lot of means at their disposal. Maybe people aren't investing necessarily in them like they're investing into the top prospects. So they want to find a means to basically raise capital themselves, I suppose you could put it, right? To invest in themselves. Is that so?
Absolutely. You're right.
And I remember you talk about these, and they're doing it by means of these human capital contracts, right?
Yes. So there's different formulas or different models for human capital contracts. So the first one, which is a little bit more intuitive, perhaps, is what I will call the equitization model. So basically, what happens is a financial firm will value each player. So based on their talent, the club they play for, different aspects, their statistics at the minor league level or even in college, and they will try to forecast the probabilities that this player will become first a major league player, and second, how much earnings this player might get during his career. And basically, the conversation turns around, okay, let's say you are valued at X dollar. Well, actually, I'm not sure they will actually say that, like they will necessarily put a valuation number, but what they will say really is, what if I give you $500,000 now in exchange for 5% of your future earnings? And the players will have to assess whether this is a good deal or not for him. And in some cases, players will take it for various reasons that we can discuss later. Sometimes they will decline it. And if they decline it, that might be because they consider the amount of money not being worth it. Because I don't know, most players will overvalue themselves. That's normal. But sometimes they just don't need the money. If you got a $4 million contract as a signing bonus, you don't necessarily need the extra $500,000. But if you got $50,000 as a signing bonus, you may jump on this amount. So because you can invest it in yourself, you can stop working in the off season, you can hire coaches, you can eat well, you can have your own apartment. There's a lot of and maybe some of them are just going to say, well, you know what? There's chances that I'm not going to make it, and I will invest this amount in other securities, in the real estate or whatever, so to make sure that I have something left if I don't make it. So they can do whatever they want with that. But most players will try to invest it in themselves because they see that amount as the key for them to make it at the major league level. So that's the first model.
Just maybe really quick here. So you're saying there's companies out there who are kind of evaluating players from a financial perspective, the way venture capitalists might evaluate startups, and try to basically invest at that level.
Yes, the comparison with the venture capitals, venture cap is right on. That's basically the same thing. So they invest in the potential of a human being, in that case, a baseball player or a football player or hockey player, any kind of athlete, and they basically expect or hope to get an amount back if the player makes it. So if the player after 2 years is released, retire, the firm will not get anything out of it. So that's not a loan. That's an equity stake that the firm takes into a player's career.
Okay. What's the other model?
The other model is what is called an income pooling. So basically, there's one firm that I know that I was part of my study that's doing that. So they evaluate, they assess each player's potential earnings. So same kind of idea that they're going to value the human capital of each player. But what they do is they try to put similar value players together in a pool. The pool may have 3 people or 30 people or 50 people. It doesn't really matter. But what they agree, the people in that pool, is that they're going to share a certain percentage of their future earnings with the other members of the pool. So at time zero, everybody is considered to have a similar kind of expected value. But as years pass by, some players become superstars and earn millions of dollars. Others will become will leave baseball with nothing left. So you don't necessarily know what the actual value of your human capital is, but at time zero, everybody is valuable, and you accept to share your potential upside to protect your downside. This is a model that is, in theory, very interesting for the highest, the high bonus players, the big prospects. Why? Because if you put 10 of them in a pool, you're pretty sure that at least 5 of them are going to make a lot of money in their career. You don't know which 5,
Right.
but you know that some of them will. So if you get into that, even if your upside is tremendously high, there's always the risk of injury. There's always a risk of underperformance. There's a lot of, in the baseball jargon, there's a lot of can't miss prospect that actually missed. So you basically protect yourself, and you ensure that you're going to get some money out of your human capital at time zero, because you pull with some very other very talented individuals.
It's a form of insurance.
It is a form of insurance in a way. Yeah, we can frame it that way. Now, because of overconfidence, because of the counseling that they get from their agents, it is actually very difficult to attract these top prospects into these pools. They don't want to necessarily, they don't want to believe that they might miss. They don't want to believe that they will not become superstars. And there's some pride in it. You don't necessarily want to live off somebody else in a way. So it's not very popular for the for the top end players. It is much more popular for the lower end players because they have nothing to lose. Most of them realize that, you know what, I might not become a superstar, but maybe someone else in the pool will be, and I can make some decent money out of my baseball career. But unfortunately, the odds are being what they are. Even in a pool of 30 people, it's very possible that nobody out of the top of these 30 players are going to be major league players and make a lot of money. If you get one, that's good for everybody, but it's possible that no one will make money, and there's not going to be any cash swaps eventually.
So this is fascinating. I remember when before I moved to Gen 2, I was in blockchain for 6 or 7 years. And I know there were a lot of projects trying to use tokens to basically allow athletes to sell equity shares, in essence, in themselves, and that kind of thing. What you're talking about is similar, but also with this pooling a bit different. How can I imagine, like, how popular is this? How many companies are doing it? How many athletes are doing it? Is it a new thing? Is it growing?
Well, there's not a ton of companies doing that. So I'm aware of a couple of companies doing the equitization model. I'm aware of one company doing the income pooling model. It was well received. Well, no, I wouldn't say it was well received. It was received with some skepticism, obviously, at first. The equitization model has grown. So the firms in that field are doing quite well. I think the income pooling firm has moved away from baseball players and focuses more now on other high volatility earners like business people, lawyers.
Wow.
So anytime you have volatility in your future income, you might be a good candidate for income pooling. So they're trying to leverage this area outside of sport. But if you want my opinion, I think that could be potentially something interesting for other folks. I'm a university professor. I am not going to make $1 million out of my work a year, but I will have a decent income stream for the next 25, 30 years. I have a full pension. So I'm a very safe asset from a human capital perspective. I don't have upside, but I don't have a lot of downside. Could I pool my income with some high volatility people and say, okay, I'm going to be the bond in the portfolio. I'm going to generate some income for you guys where when you are trying to make it in a high volatility career. And if you make it, well, I'm gonna recoup my investment. I will make some money out of it. If not, well, I will have supported other people in their dreams. So that could be a possibility. It's not something that is happening a lot right now, because I think the way income pooling works is they're trying to put not only similar people in terms of expected value, but people that know each other. So there's a community involved. So they're not trying necessarily to match outsiders to that. But this is something that could, in theory, be done and be potentially interesting to expand potentially the investing universe, as you call it.
So I guess that also brings up the question of what I guess you could say are the risk of default, right? So you get to the end of this thing, and then the high earner says, "Nah, I'm not sharing."
Absolutely. So this is why the contracts here are very important, and there's a lot of legal implications. And there's also maybe to explain why these contracts are not mainstream yet is for tax reasons. So in the United States, they managed to say, okay, if you pay some money to a pool or if you pay some money back to the firm, you can actually deduct this from your taxable income, which is not necessarily the case everywhere. So it's not something that can be done in Canada, for example. So if I were to invest in somebody else, I will be taxed twice, tax on my income without deducting what I sent someone else. And when I get the money back at some point, well, I'll be taxed again. So this is not necessarily a good idea from a tax perspective. In some,
you've studied the companies who are doing this, and you studied the contracts and kind of this scene. I believe you also talk to a lot of players. Is that right?
Yes.
In part, because it'd be very interesting to get their perspective from these players themselves, how they feel about assetization. I mean, you said it's generally an advantage to them, but still, there's got to be sort of a it has to be something new and different that you have to get used to, I suppose.
Absolutely. So most players, when they hear about that, they just don't know what is actually going on. You have to remember that these kids, some of them have college education, but some of them graduated from high school. Some of them are from the Dominican Republic, Venezuela. So they don't necessarily come from favorable conditions, life conditions at first. They don't speak English much when they get to minor league baseball. So there's a lot of skepticism related to these contracts. They want to make sure that they will actually benefit from it, and it's not just someone trying to take advantage of their talent, their potential. Most of them will ask their agent and financial advisor about that. And agents are not necessarily inclined to recommend players to get into that, and for different reasons. One is that the agents already have a portfolio of assets. So this assetization thing is multi-level. So you can be the asset of a lot of different organizations, firms, and people. So if you're an agent, you will have a portfolio of 20, 30, 50, 100 clients potentially, depending on how big the firm is. And you will get paid only if the player makes it. So if the player doesn't make it, you are not going to get revenues out of your relationship with the player. So if you are a minor league player and I am your agent and I see that there's potentially a lot of upside to you, I will probably say, you know what, decline it. And if you don't make it, you're left with nothing, and so am I. But if you make it and you sign a multi-million, like $100 million contract, and you realize that, oh, I need to pay this firm $10 million now, you might come back to your agent and say, why did you tell me to do that? Well, I was supposed to be a star. You should have seen the value in me. So now I have to pay that back. And I just received 500,000 from them. So I'm definitely on the losing side of this deal. And what you might do is drop me as your agent and pick another one. So so the agents don't necessarily have the incentives to recommend their players to do that, even if in some cases that will be a good idea for the players. So that's the first hurdle. Financial literacy is another one. So players don't necessarily understand the odds of making it. They don't necessarily understand how the finances work. So there's the firms have to educate them, but that's kind of tricky in a way because if the firm approaches a player, it basically tells them, you know what, if you are valuable, and if you are valuable, the player might hear from the firm is, okay, but if I'm that valuable, why should I accept this offer? So there's some kind of a paradox here. But from the interviews that I've done with players, most of them were very happy about their relationship with the firm. But there's a huge caveat to that because since these models are relatively new, the vast majority of players that I spoke with were not yet at the major league level, so they didn't have to pay back yet. So who knows what they are gonna think about that in 10 years when a significant portion of their earnings will flow back to investors or other pool members.
The companies who are doing this, are they investing on their own behalf, or are they selling kind of shares on to regular investors? Can I don't know, potentially a retail investor get in and buy a piece of a minor league player and see what happens?
Yeah, so the first model was from a company called Fantex. They were listed on NASDAQ. Well, actually, you could basically pick the player that you were interested in and invest in that player directly. But this model was not really popular for different reasons. So now the leading firms in this field are privately held. So they have potentially institutional investors or high net worth individuals, but retail investors cannot get in yet. Maybe at some point there will be an IPO, but this is not something I'm aware of.
I think this is really, really cool. Anything that we missed that you think is interesting?
Well, there's one thing that is actually it's not happening anymore, but you might be a little bit familiar to it since you are in Europe. But you know the clubs, the soccer clubs, football clubs, they buy and sell contracts of their players regularly during the window seasons, and the amount of money can be quite significant. Sometimes it's in the neighborhood
It's
of
crazy.
100 euros for Messi or Ronaldo or
100 million.
yeah, 100 million. So
Yeah.
that's crazy. And I know that at some point, when they were purchasing the contracts of other players, they involve financial firms in that. So that provided 30, 40, 50% of the amount. And these firms were basically trying to recoup their investment when the club was selling the contract back to another club. But for ethical reasons, this practice was forbidden by the UEFA a few years ago. So what is going on in baseball is not necessarily the same thing. It's not a financial firm getting into the contract with the club. It's basically with the player themselves.
Okay. Great. Well, Pier-Luc, thank you so much for being with us today and taking us under the hood.
No, that was very interesting. Looking forward to chat again.
Definitely.